In this video, we'll take a quick look at how we can get started using the SDK. We'll take a look at the different requirements for using different SDK versions and how to install the SDK. We'll also look at using the Python 3 CLI prompt way of submitting code to the SDK. And we'll take a look at creating free running separate scripts that we can create using the PyCharm-Community IDE in our Strigo environment. Within the Python 3 CLI prompt, we'll take a look at the double tab notation and what that does for us, and the equivalent dot notation that we can use within the PyCharm IDE. Okay, let's take a look at versions of the SDK. For the 3.x on-prem legacy version, we would use a username and a password as credentials. Also, we would need an activation key. But for the latest version, we would use API credentials, which we'll take a look at later in this video. So we will be going into detail for installing the latest version of the SDK and the requirements for that in this video. SDK 4.x and greater is for the latest platform version. The connection to the control hub is different, depending on the SDK version. As mentioned, for 3.x, we use username and password. For the latest version, we use API credentials from Control Hub, as shown later. So, before we move on with the use of the SDK, we need to ensure we have the correct version of it installed. Once we install the SDK later, we will try out the highlighted command to check what version was installed. Next, we'll look at installing the latest version of the SDK and the commands involved for that. Once the SDK is installed, we have two options. We'll explore both. We can run SDK commands via the Python 3 CLI prompt, or we can use the PyCharm IDE. In our Strigo environment, we can open up a terminal window. Let's install the StreamSets SDK in that window. We type pip3 space install space StreamSets. As said, this will install the latest version of the StreamSets SDK. We could install different versions, example pip3, install StreamSets, and then as shown on the slide. Let's check what version of the SDK we now have installed. Type pip3 list and then pipe this into grep StreamSets. This will tell us what pip package has been installed. That will be the StreamSets SDK version. We know this is 5.2 as it was displayed above on the installation response. Now we'll open another terminal window. PyCharm is already installed. This was done using the sudo snap install PyCharm-Community -- classic command. We've got an alias set up called PYC, which points to the PyCharm application. We want to create a new project, and we'll call it SDK Training. We'll pick up all of the site packages we had outside of PyCharm, such as StreamSets that we've just installed. We'll click Create. Let's just change some settings to make the IDE easier to see. File, Settings, Appearance, Theme, IntelliJ Lite. So, as said, in a separate window, we can use the Python 3 prompt, the triple chevron, and then enter SDK commands to create environments, deployments, engines, pipelines, etc. Within the Python 3 prompt environment, it is not as easy to keep track of what objects you've currently built in your code. In our original window here, we can clear the screen, or we could open up a new window. Type Python 3. This gives us the triple chevron prompt. If we type in the usual initial SDK command, That command will pick up and import the Control Hub libraries from the SDK package. Now, if we hadn't installed StreamSets correctly, then we would get a problem highlighted here. This command ensures we have imported the Control Hub class from the SDK, and we can do a similar action if we want to do this in the PyCharm environment. So, if I copy from here into the PyCharm environment, I'll remove the contents of the default main.py and then run it. We can see it's finished with exit code 0. If there is a problem with this command, then the Problems tab would let me know. When I click on Problems, we can see that all it says is that it is an unused import statement. So we now have the situation where I can continue to enter SDK commands on the fly within this Python 3 prompt. Or I can use my PyCharm environment and create a script. We can then just run that script, and I'll have a record of all of the commands I need to build my objects over time. You will have a record here of your commands. You can cursor up and repeat commands, but it's difficult to keep track of what is the latest command you've typed in and what objects you've built so far in your code. Whether we're using the Python 3 prompt or whether we're using PyCharm, we still need to supply and state in our code some API credentials in each case. We get this from Control Hub. If you look at the API Credentials tab under Manage and we click on plus. Remember, this is for the latest SDK version where API credentials are required rather than username and password etc. in 3.x of the SDK. We give our credentials a name. Let's call it SDK Training, and we'll save and generate. You can see here we've been given a credential ID and a token. We'll be using both of these in our SDK code, in either the Python 3 environment or the PyCharm environment. We'll keep this window open. Either way, the next step is to set up a Control Hub object in our code. Back in the PyCharm window, if we type in SCH, because that's the name of the object we're going to create, equals Control Hub, and then credential ID equals, and that will equal the credential ID we just generated in the API credentials window. Single quotes. Go and get the credential ID, copy to clipboard, and paste it into the quotes. And then comma, token equals, single quotes, back to API credentials, copy the token, and paste it into the quotes. Now we will have our SCH object created. Let's copy and paste this line into the Python 3 window prompt. We'll do these environments in parallel for a little while, but ultimately, we will develop code in the PyCharm environment. You can see it's given us the prompt back, which means this is a valid ID and token. In PyCharm, we can run the script and get finished with exit code 0 again. This indicates that the credential ID and token are valid. So far, we have imported the required libraries, classes and methods into our environments for the SDK, and we've created an SCH Control Hub object with the necessary connection details. Now we can go ahead and create other objects, which we'll look at in later videos, such as environments, deployments, engines, and then we'll look at pipelines, jobs, and other objects. The same SCH line has been added to the Python 3 prompt window, as well as our PyCharm environment. But in the PyCharm environment, we're building up a script that can be filed and saved. We can create, run, and debug it as a freestanding script to run at any point. Once you exit from the Python 3 environment, your code will be lost, and the code objects you created will hence be lost. It's worth mentioning that once an object is created in your code using either development environment, There are ways for the system to tell us what can come next and what classes and methods are available to us once a coding object has been defined. It has to be said that just because an object, for example a pipeline, is defined in your code, it does not mean that that object will straight away exist in StreamSets itself. For example, you have to add or activate your coding object for it then to appear as an item in StreamSets. You may create an SCH object in your code, and we can find out what we can do in our code with our SCH object. It's easier to think of the creation of an object as an environment or deployment or pipeline or job. You may create a deployment object in your code, but doesn't necessarily mean that object exists in StreamSets yet. We will pursue this in a moment. First of all, how can we get the system to tell us what can come next when developing SDK code? For example, in the Python 3 environment, we can type sch dot and then press the tab key twice. This will tell me what can be used on the SCH coding object that has been created. So I could follow the SCH dot with the get environment builder, as seen here, which is the construct we'll be using next. Similarly, within the PyCharm environment, I can say SCH, and merely by pressing the dot character, I get the same list. So I should be able to pick up Get Environment Builder in the same way. And you can see that a bit further down here. Double-clicking it will add it into the code if required. We'll remove it for now. In the next video, we'll look at how to create an environment. Thanks for watching.